Hello, and welcome back to the Road to 2000s. My name is Caleb Denby, and as always, I will be your driver on this journey. Recently, I just made National Master, and that's what the last class was about. I'm going to address some speculation. The road to 2000 is staying the road to 2000. I can't guarantee I can get you guys to 2200. Just got there myself. So unless you think you've got that special X factor that you need to get to 2200, the road ends at 2000 for the moment. So with that out of the way, let's talk about the topic for tonight. So one of the most important events in the chess world is going on right now, and actually it's about to conclude. Tomorrow is the final round of the one and only FIDE World Cup. And of course, the finalists in the FIDE World Cup guarantee themselves a spot in the candidates match for the next World Championship cycle. So these two players, Liren and Teimour Radjabov, are actually in the finals. So they are both guaranteed a place in that candidates tournament. And of course, the winner of the candidates goes on to challenge Magnus for the world title in the match. So this is huge for a number of reasons. Liren was likely going to be the person to qualify by rating for the candidates, but now that he's qualified through the World Cup, that rating slot is moving down to the next highest rated player. It's looking like that might be Geary, but it still remains to be seen how the ratings shake out. I think they take an average rating, so it's unclear. But okay, this tournament's not over yet. Actually, 3 of the 4 standard games in the final match have been played. And right now, all stands level between Liren and Teimour Radjabov. And so why don't we take a look at a couple of those games, and then if you guys are interested, the final round is actually tomorrow, if you want to check that out. I highly recommend it. But okay, this was round 2, I believe, of the final between Liren and Teimour Radjabov. Liren started off with c4, the English opening. Black responded knight f6. We saw knight c3, e6. This is a very flexible way of playing from black. It doesn't really reveal to white what black wants to do. Maybe he wants to play d5 and play a more normal Queen's Gambit decline structure. He could also play something like c5 and go for Benoni-style positions. It's kind of unclear. But then with white's next move, he really makes the decision on what type of game it's going to be. White plays e4. This move, of course, eyeing this d5 square even more. Black could still play d5. This is an opening line. But black chose instead to play c5. And what does this allow for white here? There's a specific move that looks pretty natural for white to kind of shake loose some of the black pieces. Well, really the only black piece that's developed. Any ideas?
E5.
Yeah, e5. When your opponent hasn't really played to control the center, sometimes this move is playable. This e5 move, attacking this knight, and actually simply forcing it to go back to g8. So why would black play like this? Any ideas? Black willingly developed his knight, allowed white to push forward, and force his knight back to its starting square. What does black gain from doing this?
White has to commit the pawn to being on d5 and maybe be vulnerable.
Yeah, so that's a great point. As we're starting out, we're always told it's good to control the center. Put your pawns in the center to control it. But the farther up a board a pawn gets, the more weak it actually becomes. The more vulnerable to attack it becomes, just because it's simply closer to your opponent's pieces and further away from your own. So black is trying to say that white has overextended with e5. And black is actually going to play against this pawn, and that's how he's going to try to find some activity in this game. And so we'll see that happen here. White plays knight f3, a natural developing move, defending this pawn. And after knight c6, white already commits to d4. And so this is actually doing a lot. And this is actually a pawn sacrifice from white. So white has pushed this pawn very far up the board. And because of that, this pawn is slightly weak. And by playing d4, white is already jettisoning this pawn. He's giving it away. And he's saying it was worth giving the pawn away because you had to waste time with your knight. And so this is kind of the character of the game we see. The pawn sacrifice is played out with c takes d4, knight takes d4, removing the defender of this pawn. Knight takes e5 is played. And now white plays knight d b5. So we kind of see the point of white's play. Black has one piece developed, but it's kind of on a loose, undefended square. This knight has wasted a couple tempi by coming out and going back. And already, white is aiming at some weak squares in the black position. Of course, Radjabov was a very well-prepared player. He probably saw this line coming. And so he plays a6, actually forcing the knight onto the d6 square, where he gives up his bishop, white captures, and after f6, we kind of get a stable position. White simply develops, black simply develops, and white goes in for this pretty forcing line with bishop b6, which forces black to play knight f5. Otherwise, of course, the queen is actually simply trapped. Queen b4, knight c6, queen c5, queen e7. So what do you think's going on here? Obviously, black is still up a pawn, but it's fair to say that white has some compensation for it. So what compensation does white have here? It can be kind of tough to actually, say it, out loud. Like, okay, yeah, sure, I have compensation, but what is the compensation? Where is it at? How is white justifying being down a pawn here? What do you think? Yeah, this bishop is not a good piece. It's going to take black some time to improve this piece. Maybe he'll have to do, a couple moves before it can get to a reasonable square. Anything else?
It follows that rook is going to have a hard time getting at it.
Yeah, so some awkward development for black. This rook and this bishop both kind of on uncomfortable squares. What else do you think? What else are some of white's advantages here? So one, I'll use the word imbalance. It's a word that Jeremy Silman uses a lot. One imbalance here, in almost any position like this, to look at is the minor pieces. So black has two knights and one bishop, and we already said this bishop's pretty bad, whereas white has two bishops and one knight. And so when you get this type of thing, where one side has a bishop that the other does not, it's really important to look at that color squares. So of course, the missing bishop for black is this dark squared bishop. So a lot of white's play is going to come from the dark squares. So if black's dark squares are weak, he's going to be in some trouble. If he can use his pawns to kind of control the dark squares, that's the standard way of playing against a bishop that you don't have. You use your pawns to control those squares that your missing bishop cannot. So what do you think? Are black's dark squares going to be pretty well controlled by the pawns here? Or are there going to be some weaknesses that white can try to exploit to make this bishop good or bad? It's kind of tough, right? And it's kind of an unfair question to ask because it kind of remains to be seen, right? Right now, this bishop looks okay. It's on a pretty good square on b6. But you can imagine black would play some natural moves like d6, maybe e5 like we said, and really try to shut this bishop out of the game. But these are the things you should be keeping in mind here in a position like this. I won't ask you if you think this compensation is enough for the pawn, because obviously these are two very high-level players. The position is about balance, because they're both still in the opening. After queen e7, do you think white should trade queens, though? This is a question I do want to ask you. And if not, what else can he even play?
I think he should trade.
Okay, why is that?
Just because any other position he goes with the queen, it's going to get caught. Except for like maybe 8-3 to be safe.
Well, yeah, maybe it doesn't make sense to move this queen away. That's a good point. There's really no squares for it to go to. These are all kind of blocked off. But should he take on e7, or should he let black try to take on c5?
You should let black try to take.
Yeah, that's exactly right. There's a common phrase in chess. Sometimes it's a punchline, but a lot of times it makes a lot of sense. To take is a mistake. By taking a piece, you actually just serve to improve your opponent's pieces a lot of the time. And here it might look like if he takes with either knight, he's actually making his knight worse. But maybe taking with the king is actually playable here for black. And his king is centralized. It's now approaching an endgame. I wouldn't call it an endgame just yet. And his king is going to be a valuable piece in the center. So instead, white makes a useful move, castles queenside. Now, should black take? Is taking a mistake here? The question goes both ways. So what are you guys kind of thinking about when you try to answer this question?
Where's the bishop better placed?
Yeah, am I improving white's pieces? That's always a good question to ask. That's the kind of the root of the phrase to take as a mistake. It's usually you're improving your opponent's pieces by capturing. Other things to consider is, especially in this case, black has the option to just decline this trade. And that's the option that he chooses in this case. He plays d6. And so what black is saying is, I think my queen is a more useful piece than your queen. Actually, the most common move here is to actually take this queen off the board. Trading is much more common, I believe. Because in the end, white's advantage is kind of in activity, right? And there's this old adage, you should trade down when you're up in material. While that doesn't apply in every position, it makes some sense here, especially because a lot of white's play comes from, the mobility of his pieces. He can move his pieces around, attack different areas on the board, and taking off the queens kind of alleviates some of those threats. But instead, we see d6, forcing the white queen back to a3. Black castles, and white plays g4. So knight comes back to h6, and we see rook g1. So which player would you prefer here? White or black? What do you think? All right, hands up for white. All right, 2 people prefer white. Who prefers black? 4 people prefer black. So why do you guys prefer the black pieces? It's okay to say that you counted the pawns and black has more, because that's a valid reason.
Less scattered, I guess.
Less scattered. That's interesting. Yeah, I don't know. It's fair to say white's pieces are a little bit all over the place here. And whereas black, pretty compact. That's fair to say. So fair enough. Why did you two prefer the white pieces? Is it because you saw the 1 down here by the white pieces? It's also a valid reason.
White has the possibility of an attack. He's got a blockade on b6. Black has that piece. Black has a lot of work to do to fix his position. White seems to have easier ideas.
Yeah, fair enough. I think this is the... Oh, I'm sorry, did you have something to add?
No.
Oh, no, I didn't.
Okay.
No, I agree.
All right, fair enough. Supernova likes black. Interesting. So 4 people plus the YouTube chat, all preferring the black pieces. I actually prefer the white pieces here. And so this is something I've said before, I think, on the show. But when you try to evaluate a position, it can definitely be useful to say, okay, what's going on right now? What's going on here? And you say, well, okay, white's pieces look a little bit scattered, and black's pieces look pretty well, pretty more compact together. Black is currently up a pawn. And that might lead you to think that maybe black is doing okay here. But more useful when you're evaluating positions is actually to think, well, what's about to happen? What are both players going to do? Here we see white just made a move. And so what is black going to do? What are his next few moves going to be? What is black trying to do here?
Well, I think the d6 pawn is hanging. Am I wrong?
It's a valid point. The d6 pawn is hanging. So is he going to fix it somehow? Can he fix it somehow? So, he can play a move like knight f7, right? In defense. So let's say black plays the natural knight f7. Now what is white going to do? What are his next few moves going to be? He's kind of telegraphing a bit with g4. Any ideas? All right, I'll pick on Ryan, because he's the highest rated here. What do you think white should be doing, Ryan, after knight f7?
The more consistent plan would probably be to play f4 and go for g5. However, there is the option of knight e4 targeting d7 further.
Yeah, so these ideas of f4, possibly going for g5, possibly looking for f5, all make sense. There's also moves like knight e4 to look at. So really, what's going to happen is white and black both need to play to improve their pieces. And the question is, whose plans are actually coming through faster? Whose plans are going to make more sense here? And I think the answer to that is actually white's plans are coming through faster. And we'll see in the game, knight f7 was actually played. And white did ahead, continue with f4. And he's already looking at things like g5. He's looking at things like knight e4, putting some more pressure onto these pawns. Whereas black would love to play a move like e5, but there's a big downside to this. What's the downside to e5? Trying to open up this bishop.
Lets his knight take d5.
Yes, that's exactly right. It undefends the d5 square, and it makes white's knight incredibly strong. Looking at squares like c7, already just hitting the queen. Looking at squares like f6, potential sacrifices are on white's mind, especially after g5. So e5, not really the best move for black to look out for here. And so because of that, white has a very concrete plan to improve his pieces. He just wants to break open these dark squares, like I said, paying attention to that color complex of the bishop that he has and his opponent doesn't. And whereas black doesn't seem to have a concrete plan to improve this bishop, to improve these rooks. It's very difficult to get these pieces out, especially if e5 is not a good move, which it isn't here. And so because of that, because of what's going to happen, that's why I preferred the white pieces. And that can be really difficult to look at from a distance. But it's all about finding the ideas, finding the plans, and trying to find them pretty early on. So you can make these decisions pretty early on. Do I want to go for this type of position? Or do I want to go for this other type of position, which I might be down a pawn here, but at least I know what I'm doing. I have clear plans, and I don't know what my opponent's really going to be trying to do. And those are the type of positions you want to go for. The ones where you know what's going on, you know what you're doing, and your opponent has to kind of struggle to come up with something. That's really where you can prove an advantage, even at the highest levels of chess. That's how they really do it. So in short, I prefer white here. Black continues with bishop d7, connecting these rooks and slightly improving this bishop. White continues very naturally. He wants to play g5, so he prepares it with h4. Black continues with a5 now, trying desperately to find maybe some squares for like this knight or something, or I don't know. a5 seems like a pretty slow move, but like I said, it's very tough to come up with moves for black here. And white wastes no time. He simply plays g5. We see king h8, a preparatory move, getting off this file. And now let me ask you kind of the critical question. So white has been making these moves, playing to loosen up the dark squares. So we preferred white. Well, I preferred white because of his plan. His plan was more clear. And now that his plan is actually happening, we need to deal with the specifics. So what are the specifics? What's the best way for white to really crack open this position? What do you think? I'll give you some options. You can play a move like g6, hitting the knight in h7. You can play a move like h5, going for h6. Play a move like g takes f. You can even play a move like f5, we'll say. Or you can play a move like knight e4, just bringing more pieces in. Or bishop h3, just developing pieces. These are a lot of options that white has going on here in his mind. So what do you think? Which ones do you prefer? It's a very tough question, but I just want to get your ideas. I'll give you a minute to think about this one because it's not easy. Not easy at all. Someone in the YouTube chat had pawn. couple people just want to develop the bishop. All right, what do you guys think in the live audience? What do you think? Don't want to single you out.
Yeah, I like moving rook to e1.
Rook e1? Yeah, that's a reasonable move. Totally reasonable. A lot of ideas like knight d5 start coming to mind. The best thing to think about here is when you're deciding on these moves, you don't really want to say, okay, well, what's the best move for me? You know, you do want to think about that a little bit, but more importantly, you think you have a good position. It's more important to ask, well, what can my opponent do to get out of it? What's my opponent going to be able to do in response? So c5 looks like a good move at first glance. You know, it's attacking this d6 square, you know, really threatening to open things up. But then the problem is, well, okay, but my opponent can kind of get out of things with d5. And this is how you kind of evaluate these moves. So does anybody like g6? You like g6? Or you have a question?
I like G6.
You like g6. So yeah, this move makes a lot of sense. But, you know, what is black going to do to kind of try to save his position here? Let's say he plays, I actually don't have prep on this one. Let's play just knight h6. He just steps out of the way. How are you breaking through? All right, you can take on h7 maybe. King takes. Give a check. Maybe he'll block it. You know, he seems to be defending. And a big problem is you've left a couple pawns behind, which you're kind of going to get in your own way. So maybe g6 isn't best, because you see, okay, knight h6, I don't see what's next for me. My opponent has a good response. What about g takes f? Any ideas of what black might do there? h5 you can't really do yet, because tactically it just hangs this pawn. And so Ding noticed all of these, and he just made a simple improving move. I think rook e1 is a fine move. I think bishop d3 is also a reasonable move. But his choice was to get his piece that was furthest away from the action back into the game. So he played queen b3, aiming to get this queen back over here. And this is not the fastest way to play, and maybe not even the best move, but it's very practical. You say, okay, I don't think my opponent's really going to do much. If he plays e5, there's always this knight d5 thing to look out for. I'm just going to bring in all of my pieces, every last one, into the attack. Sanity said queen b3. I don't know when he said that. If that was seconds ago. Well, maybe he cheated and heard me, but we'll give him the benefit of the doubt. So shout out to him. Queen b3 was the move. Black plays rook c8, trying to improve his pieces, but you'll notice that these moves actually don't seem to do a whole lot. White continues with king b1, slowly improving his position, stepping off of this file. We see e5 finally come from black. So I've been talking a lot about the problem with e5, the problem, of course, being knight d5, but black decided enough is enough. I need to open up this bishop, no matter the cost. So he just allows knight d5. And I think this is actually, this is black's big mistake so far, is e5. And this is something that happens. If you have a good position and you kind of just wait for a second, a lot of times your opponent gets tired of sitting around and being passive, and they overcommit to something. This is a fantastic way to win games without risking much, is you let your opponent make all the mistakes. You give him enough rope to hang himself with, is the quote. And in this case, that's exactly what happens. e5, trying to open up this bishop, but giving away this square is simply too much. This bishop comes to f5. The king drops over to a1. The queen comes up to e6. And now with this knight on d5, what is the way to continue? Is it time to open it up, or should we bring our pieces closer somehow?
Couldn't you fork the rook and
You could. You absolutely could. But this knight's worth more than that rook. I think white would have a very good position here after the fork. I'm not entirely sure. There's also some tactical problems, it seems like, with knight d4 going on. So I got to look out for some stuff. But even just rook takes c7, bishop takes c7, this is what black was really hoping for. You know, he's getting counterplay against the white king, and only at the price of an exchange. So, okay, what do you think? Anybody? Open it up or make an improving move? Professor L. Axis, left axis, I assume, wants to play bishop g2. Simply improving the pieces connecting the rooks. Who likes bishop g2 and who likes g takes f6? Opening it up. I'll take a show of hands since nobody wants to talk. G takes f6. 2 votes. Bishop g2. 0 votes. 3 of our class members are undecided, which is understandable. This is a very complicated position. I think white is still doing pretty well after bishop g2, but something has changed. So earlier, I was really talking up the benefits of playing slow, improving moves, waiting for your opponent to make a mistake. But in this case, your opponent has useful things that he can do. And so if you sit around and don't do a whole lot, he'll start to be making threats of his own with things like knight b4, aiming for these weak light squares. And so you got to really be careful. It's good to make slow, improving moves when you don't think your opponent can do a lot. But as soon as they make some commitment where they activate some of their pieces, you really have to be on the lookout, or else they'll start finding counterplay, which is what they were hoping for. So in this case, I think it's better to play quickly, as Ding did, with g takes f6, g takes f6. And then he played a kind of prophylactic move, which was totally fine, with a3, keeping an eye on this troublesome knight. Black continued, though, with rook b8, stepping out of this fork finally. White continued with the natural bishop g2. Black plays rook g8. We see knight e3. So white has opened the g file, and these light squares are now forever weak, and so white is kind of switching game plans. He's just attacking these light squares now. We see knight d4. Of course, making a lot of threats, but luckily white has the answer. You can never use white's dark squares because he still has this bishop. And so now was the time when Ding cashed in and captured. And we see takes, 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 bishop d5. And let's stop in this position, I guess. And what do you think is going on now after the complications have mostly resolved? Do you prefer white still or black still, or do you prefer white now? Or have you switched back and forth and then back again to the black pieces?
Still prefer white.
Still prefer white. Why is that?
My team's had the advantage here. Seems to have some pieces, important pieces, like in his line of sight.
Yeah. So black's big advantage was the number of pawns. I think that was fair to say. And it looks like that extra pawn is going to fall off the board. In addition to that, white still has this advantage in activity. He has this monster bishop sitting on a centralized outpost. This knight does not really make a good impression. No real future on these two squares. And there's still some tactical issues for black to work out. This knight is hanging. There's a pin on the knight. And so black has to play some unnatural moves. He has to take and play knight h6. And especially now, you can really see that white's advantage in activity gives him all sorts of good moves here. One such move being queen b6, really exposing how all of black's pawns are undefended and weak. And so white went on to pretty quickly win this game. Bishop d7 was played, queen takes d4. And after queen e7, king a2, knight f5. After h5, h6, really just proving a point that this king is going to be forever weak. We see knight e3, and after rook e3, black went ahead and resigned this position. Of course, you all see the tactical point of rook e1. What happens after knight d5? Okay, I take this. He takes this with check, so you got to be a little bit careful here. Ding was a little bit more clever than that.
Queen takes f6. Does that work? No.
So yeah, the queen takes f6 would be nice if the queen had to recapture.
Yeah.
This would be a nice mate.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, the knight also defends this square.
So
But it makes a good point that these two pieces can't really leave where they are right now. Queen g3. It's a little too much. It's a little too much. So there's the oldest rule in chess. This is one I like to say a lot when players are getting too fancy. He took your bishop. You should take him back. Of course, the point is now you can't capture on e1 because the queen was needed to defend this square. And if you move the queen out of the way, I will take on e8 with the same idea. And so black would just be more or less checkmated here. And the same problems exist on this turn. If black passes, I'll take this knight, and you can't recapture due to the same threat. So black resigned here. And this was, I think, a really well-played game by white. Just really showing how the activity in pieces can be used, really proving the point that if you have a plan and your opponent doesn't, then it's going to be very, very difficult for them to play. And likely, they're going to have to create some weakness. But then there was also this moment where once black committed to e5, activating his bishop, that was the point where white had to kind of switch roles. He had this lasting advantage with this knight on d5. Now he just had to make sure that black's pieces weren't going to get too active and his plans were more important. Any questions about this game? Any questions? Anything you didn't understand? It was a complex game. Okay, I'll talk about it quickly in a recap. So we had this opening where black sacrificed time to force white to weaken his pawn. And white simply gives up this pawn in the opening to really increase his advantage in time and development, turn that into some better pieces. And so he cashes in here with knight d6, getting an advantage with the dark squared bishop, whereas black does not have a dark squared bishop and is already committed to some dark squared weaknesses. He then used this advantage to plant this bishop on b6, and after some more moves, we realized it's going to be kind of tough to develop this piece, as well as this rook. And then white didn't waste much time. He found his plan. He wanted to expand on the king's side, loosen up these dark squares to improve this bishop, and then he just followed through with it very naturally. Rook g1, f4, h4, g5. He brought his last piece closer to the game, and when black overcommitted, he stepped in, improved his knight, and made sure that nothing was going on with black's activity. Kept this knight out of the game, kept all of black's pieces at bay, and then managed to convert. Very nicely. So, yeah. Game ended here with resignation. So, fortunately for Radjabov, this wasn't the end of the match. This was game 2 in the match, I believe, and then game 3 was actually played, I think earlier today, could have been yesterday, I might be off on that. And Radjabov actually won that game. So we now have a tied match going into the final round tomorrow. So in fairness, we'll take a look at this game as well. Radjabov chose e4 rather than c4. Ding responded with e5, knight f3, knight c6. And I don't want to talk too much about this opening because it's one of the most common in all of chess, of course, the Roy Lopez. And then I think at the top level, usually when grandmasters with black want to make a draw, they'll play the Berlin. In this case, Ding wanted to make a draw, and he did something that they used to do a lot, but don't do quite as much at the top level, and that is play the Marshall. How many of you are familiar with the Marshall Gambit or Marshall attack? Nobody. Well, interesting. Let me introduce it to you. So white wants to play in the center, but black plays in the center first. He gets his king out of there, and then he immediately plays d5 with no preparation like c6 or anything, just goes for it in the center. The downside to this is white can capture, black can capture, and after knight takes e5, knight takes e5, rook takes e5, white is simply up a pawn. But, of course, there is compensation. I'll play a couple more moves. d3 was played in this game. d4, I think, is the other main line. We see bishop d6, rook e1, and bishop f5. One more move for white, queen f3, defending this pawn, defending some squares on the king's side. And so, what do you think about this? None of you are familiar with the Marshall, but what do you think's going on here? Where is black's compensation in this case?
More development.
Yeah, it's really this advantage in time. He's got all of his minor pieces developed, whereas two of white's are sitting on the back row. And this bishop really isn't making the best impression over here on b3. As well as the fact that all of black's pieces are kind of pointed at this king's side. And you'll notice most of white's pieces are not on the king's side. And that's where he kind of generates threats, generates his attack. And lastly, white's extra pawn is sitting here on d3, which is not the most impressive square for an extra pawn to be sitting on. Kind of similar to the d6 pawn that we saw in the last game, being the extra pawn. But I think this is all still theory. g3 is forced, and now black gets some extra compensation in the form of weak light squares. Queen h3, bishop e3, and white actually gives back the pawn now in order to develop this knight. We see queen f5, bishop d4, rook f d8, a4, h6, h4, rook a c8. And this is actually apparently a game that Ding has had, a line that Ding has played before with the black pieces against Wesley So, and that one actually ended in a draw. We'll see here that Radjabov actually deviated from that game. In the other game, a takes b was played. Radjabov chose queen takes f5, and now this game was officially unique after bishop takes f5. So white has solved a lot of his problems in the opening. He developed all of his pieces. Yes, these light squares are a little bit weak, but the queens are off the board. Black's not going to be checkmating white here. And all of his pieces are developed at the cost of losing his extra pawn. So what do you think is going on now? Level game, nothing to worry about for either side? Or is one side to be preferred? What do you think? Any ideas? So like I said, when you're trying to evaluate a position like this, it's always best to think about what's going to happen rather than how things currently are. So currently, I would say black actually has a small edge in development still. These rooks are kind of both centralized. White's rook's still sitting on a1. This rook's on a nice open file, though. This knight also maybe not on the best square just yet. But we see, black just had to recapture, so it's white's turn. So what is white going to do to improve his pieces? Is there a way to improve his pieces?
Well, I would do the move in the other game. A takes.
Ah, yeah, so a takes b5, a very natural move, and this would actually activate the rook.
Yeah.
So we see, okay, white can activate this rook. That's good for him. What can he do about this knight? How can he activate this knight?
Probably move to f3.
Yeah, he could come to f3, but then, what is the knight doing on f3?
He covers like a few dark squares, but that's about it.
Yeah, he covers a few dark squares. Maybe later on it could jump into e5. There's also this idea of knight e4 for white, right? Looking at this dark square in particular, which can be pretty useful in gaining time on the bishop. So yeah, knight f3 is not a bad move. It's a very natural idea. So the point is, white has these moves to try to improve his pieces a little bit. Whereas I would argue, maybe for black, that's not quite as easy here. And we'll see that white managed to actually turn this into something. I don't think black is in any serious danger yet. I think this is a fine position for black. But it's just noticing I would rather have the white pieces probably, because I know what I'm doing. I know what I can do to improve my pieces. And those are the positions that, once again, I think you should really aim for. So, yep, Professor Left Axis actually also agrees, wants to play knight e4. Very nice idea. Danny Machuca is in the YouTube chat. Very excellent video team member here at the St. Louis Chess Club. In the game, white actually did play knight e4, improving this knight, hitting this bishop. Black continues with bishop f8, and white improves this knight further by bringing it to c5. And so I think the order in which white did this is actually super important. Once again, a common phrase, to take is a mistake. So if white had played a takes b5 here, activating this rook first, maybe black would take with the a pawn. And then there's the slight nuance that after knight c5, you are hitting air instead of hitting an a6 pawn. And so just be on the lookout for that. Before you commit to making trades, think to yourself, is this actually helping my opponent in any way? And in this case, I think it would have. So after knight c5, black has to do something about this a6 pawn. Comes up with a rather tactical solution by playing knight b4. If this pawn were to capture this knight, of course, it leaves this bishop behind. White also might try to play some tactics, like bishop g7 you might be thinking about, but this actually leaves behind, let's see, leaves behind a lot of stuff. Maybe this would be the best way for black to play. Hitting this rook, as well as this bishop. And this wouldn't be much for white. So knight b4, tactical solution to his current problem. So instead of going for any of these crazy lines, white continues improving his pieces. Just plays rook e5, hitting this bishop, forcing this bishop to do something awkward, or forcing black to play g6, making maybe some weaknesses in the king. White decides that the time is right to capture on b5 now. So he takes, we see c takes, and now more tactics are played with knight e6, which is a pretty insane move. Just putting your knight on a square where it is undefended and, well, attacked by a pawn. So what is the point of knight e6? First of all, what if black just ignores it? What happens? Black just moves this rook out of the way. What was white's point? Any ideas? I think white can win a piece here. If not, he'll get a very good position. It is still kind of messy. What do we think? So as always, you want to start with maybe some forcing moves, look at some captures, look at some checks. Don't see any checks.
So now we can take the knight. I mean, the rook's not attacking the bishop anymore.
Yeah, so that's a very relevant point. This rook has moved off of the attack of the bishop. So this tactic looks a little bit different. Of course, however, we've placed our knight onto this square where it is hanging. So maybe if we take the knight, he would take over. So do what?
Take that bishop.
Yeah, I think that's right. So you could take this bishop, and then of course if black just recaptures, then we take this guy and be up a piece. Either way. There are some messy things going on here with something like this, but I think bishop d6 would be enough to really guarantee a winning position. So black can't just ignore it. So what's the tactical point if he takes this knight? What is white going to play?
Rook takes bishop, and then bishop takes e6.
Yeah, that's a great point. In the game, bishop takes e6 was actually played. But if you had done this, we would take this bishop and then take this pawn. But okay, bishop takes instead. The same idea follows. Rook takes e6, fe6. Bishop takes, king h7. And now we take this rook. He takes us back. And what has happened at the end of the day? White has won a pawn, one way or another. Down a piece, but you take the piece back. I'm sorry. The line wasn't quite done yet. So c takes b4. White is up a pawn. He has a lot of weaknesses on the queen's side, though. This bishop is really eyeing this pawn currently. And so definitely not an easily winning position by any stretch of the imagination. The next move was rook c4, hitting both of these pieces. The bishop comes to f6. Black decides, I want this bishop off the board because, as we all know, all rook endgames are drawn. But instead, white says, no, I think I'll keep this bishop on the board. And now we see rook c6. Black just defends this pawn. White plays this slightly awkward-looking rook a2, just taking the slow route, defending his pawns, shoring up all his weaknesses. And now I think black really, here is where I think black started missing his chances to draw this game. So black played a very natural move. Black played king g8. But the natural moves actually weren't enough here. This was actually a pretty serious mistake for black. So I'll let you try and figure out the improvement for black. Black has to do something concrete to make sure that white can't just build up his position here. Something immediate. And by immediate, I don't mean like on the next turn he does something and then white has to give up on winning. But he has to play quickly here. Otherwise, white will be able to permanently improve his pieces. Yes, and I did want to mention, rook a2 is the beginning of the immortal Machuca rook maneuver, where you activate the rook by bringing it to the second rank and then moving it over. So this is a tough question. I'll let you guys come up with at least some kind of idea here. Something concrete.
White can move the bishop to c5 and have the rook probably take it, and then he can take the pawn maybe.
So yeah, it's black to move. So we're trying to find the way black can try to hold this position forever. But it's a good point. White is only one move away from putting this bishop on a square where it's very nicely defended. And you can imagine, let's say if this bishop, let's say this line happened, and bishop f8, you could try and shake this piece loose still. You still have this option to try to shake the piece loose. So someone has suggested bishop f6, a pretty natural move, just trying to trade off the bishops. And this is the crux of the drawing idea here for black, is if you can get these bishops off the board with causing no further harm to your position, you should be able to draw pretty easily. This rook endgame should be a draw. And so the question is, how can I immediately make sure these bishops get off the board? And that's what black really kind of missed here. Bishop f6, actually not quite the way to do it, because there is this nice bishop c5 move. And now, if you bring your king to the center, I have this nice move b3, activating my rook. And by the time you play a move trying to shake loose my bishop, I can play this move, defending and keeping my bishop here forever. And after something like this, now this rook endgame might not be so easy to hold. It's much easier with these pawns staying doubled. So this was the immediacy that black missed. White has this nice idea of kind of cementing this bishop on c5. And so if black doesn't play immediately, for example like this, white can improve his position and make sure that this bishop trade isn't ever going to be very good for black. So what black should have done is actually bishop e5. This is the way to force the bishops off the board. Now no matter what white does, bishop d6 comes next with a fork. And there's really no way to stop the bishops coming off here. And this would have been the pretty nice drawing idea, I think, for Ding. Instead, though, we see king g8. Yeah, rook a2, we saw king g8. And now after bishop c5, this bishop is very nicely planted here. We see king f7, king g2, king e6, b3. Finally, the rook sees daylight again. After h5, king f3, king f5. You see white slowly bringing his pieces forward. Rook d2. Once again, the immortal Machuca rook. Bishop e5, rook d5. And now this is still a tough endgame. I wouldn't say white is completely winning here, but it's tough for black to kind of make moves, right? This rook seems kind of pinned in on the 6th rank, guarding these weaknesses. White's pieces are nice and active, and if black isn't careful, this king's just going to come in. In the game, king e6 was played, which just allows king e4, and this was kind of doom for Ding. Doom for Ding after king e4. A slightly better try might have been king f6, and after king e4, you can hold this bishop on e5 for slightly longer, make it a little bit more troublesome for this king to stay on such an advanced square. But after king e6, king e4, bishop f6. Now white is pushing forward, shaking loose this h5 pawn, and black can't hold on to everything here. And we see the pieces come over. h5 will fall, and these two connected pass pawns will win the game. And so that's how Radjabov managed to equalize the score in the World Cup. Once again, final round of the standard tomorrow. If they happen to draw that game, they will move into tiebreaks, which I think there's a whole complicated series of tiebreaks. They play like 2 25-minute games, then 2 10-minute games, then 2 blitz games, and then an Armageddon if they're still tied after that. So that'll be definitely one to watch. Unless I'm mistaken, Ding gets the white pieces again tomorrow, so he'll be the one likely trying to press, trying to end this match. But if not, we'll get treated to some very interesting tiebreaks on the following day. So I would be sure to check this one out. It starts tomorrow morning. I think it's pretty early our time. But if you want to set your alarms, get up for it. I would highly recommend checking out these games. Once again, so the ideas we were looking at today was mostly about trying to evaluate positions and trying to figure out our plans. And if you're doing this pretty early on, you can kind of steer the game towards a position where you know your plan, you're solid in your plan, and that's like the minimum that you want. You want to be able to figure out your plan and your position and have something to do with your pieces. And that's what makes it so much easier to play. If you can do it, then it's even better if you can force your opponent into a position where it's slightly unclear what his plan's going to be, how he's going to improve his pieces. We definitely saw more of that in the first game. But even in this game, we saw earlier on here, out of the opening, we saw these plans for white to improve his pieces, and we saw that black was just kind of forced to react to them. He didn't have many plans of his own just yet. And so this is how these players are proving an advantage. And you might think that my games are decided by tactical blunders, this doesn't affect me in any way, but that's really not true, because tactical blunders often happen when you get yourself into a worse position where your pieces don't make sense. And so if you're playing moves that improve your pieces, make your pieces coherent and working together, that's the best way to avoid positions where you're falling in for these tactics. And obviously these blunders are always going to happen, but you can at least limit them in this way by playing plans that make sense, ways to improve your pieces, and kind of keeping your opponent penned in. So that's the takeaway that you can take away from these games that are played at such a high level. You can still try to emulate some of this in your games. And yes, the results are going to be different. You're not going to start playing like Ding Liren out of nowhere, but it is still useful to learn in your games. And that's why I recommend watching chess at a high level. It gives you something to try and strive for, try and play for. Any questions about this game? Any questions about the lecture in general tonight? From YouTube, from you guys here in the audience? Yeah?
In this game, much earlier, why play d3 instead of d4?
Yes.
Eventually, the dark square bishop was on d4, so that's a difference. But
So I'm not going to lie to you. I don't know all the nuances of the martial attack. d4 is the main line here, and this has been played, thousands of times. And all I know is theoretically it's supposed to be equal for black. The idea with bringing the pawn to d3, I think, is to keep some of these squares more under control, keep this diagonal a little bit more closed to hamper these light squared plans from black. But I'm going to be 100% honest with you. I don't know that for sure.
As long as you can keep it, I guess.
Well, yeah, and the idea sometimes is to give it away in exchange for time, like we saw this game for white here. But yeah, the Marshall is a very old, very nuanced opening. It's one of the best defenses for black against the Roy Lopez, and so I don't want to touch that and pretend I'm an expert on it, because I'm not. I don't play this with either color. Any other questions? All right, well, in that case, I don't see anything from the YouTube chat. Thank you guys for joining me tonight. This has been another episode of The Road to 2000. Be sure to join me next week. I will be back, and we'll continue our path on the road. Thanks.